In a city ruled by corruption and shadow, one man stands against an empire built on lies and blood. Tom Hardy, a relentless force of justice, is on the trail of Donovan Black, a mastermind with plans to reshape the power structure of the entire city. With everything on the line, Tom must infiltrate a fortress of crime, face impossible odds, and confront a man who thinks he's untouchable. But when the final battle arrives, will Tom's fight for justice finally break the chains of corruption, or will the darkness claim victory once and for all? This is the moment where everything changes. It was a cold evening, and the streets of London were shrouded in a thin mist, the glow of streetlights barely cutting through the fog. Tom Hardy, dressed in a leather jacket and dark jeans, was leaning against his custom motorcycle, the low hum of the engine almost hypnotic in the otherwise still air. He just finished a long day of filming for his latest project, but even as an actor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He'd been here before, that itch at the back of his mind that something was about to happen. Across the street, in the dim light, he saw two figures on bikes, no helmets, their faces partially obscured by dark scarves. Their motorcycles roared to life, cutting through the silence with an intensity that immediately felt off. Tom's instincts told him to stay alert, and for good reason. Something in the air seemed thick with tension. He hadn't been involved in any real fights lately, but there was an energy tonight that he couldn't ignore. He was just about to mount his bike and head home when his eyes caught a flash of movement. A man, hurriedly walking toward a nearby alley, was suddenly cornered by the two bikers. "Hey, where you think you're going?" one of the bikers sneered, his voice grating and hostile. Tom felt his jaw tighten. He could see the man, small and thin, trying to back away, his hands raised defensively. The bikers were laughing now, one of them revving his engine as if to intimidate him. It was clear they were after something, probably his money, maybe worse. Before he could stop himself, Tom found himself walking toward the confrontation. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he couldn't just stand by and watch. Something deep inside him, the same part of him that had driven him to take on the hardest roles in his career, told him this was a moment that demanded action. He knew how to fight. He'd learned the art of self-defense growing up in the rougher parts of London, and although his life had shifted to the world of film, the streets still ran through his veins. What made him different from the average man was his unwillingness to back down, especially when faced with injustice. As he approached, the man in the alley seemed to recognize something in him. His wide eyes flicked to Tom, then to the bikers. "What's the matter?" one of the bikers asked, squinting at Tom. "You want to join in on the fun, hero?" Tom's lips twitched into a brief, sardonic smile. "I don't like bullies," he said simply. "And I really don't like people who think they can push others around just because they've got a bike." The bikers laughed again, but this time, it didn't sound as confident. They weren't used to someone speaking up, especially not a guy who looked like he could handle himself. Tom had a reputation on screen, but the truth was, he didn't need to act tough. The air around him seemed to shift when he spoke. The tension hung heavy for a few seconds. And then, as if on cue, one of the bikers lunged forward, swinging a fist toward Tom's face. It was a cheap shot, but that was the thing about bullies. They never expected someone to fight back. Tom dodged effortlessly, his body moving with precision and grace. He wasn't some stranger to a fistfight. As the biker stumbled past him, Tom quickly turned, grabbing the man by the arm and flipping him over his shoulder. The biker hit the ground with a thud, wind knocked out of him. The second biker roared in fury and gunned the throttle of his bike, speeding toward Tom, but he wasn't quick enough. Tom sidestepped, grabbing the approaching bike by the handlebars and wrenching it sideways. The biker crashed into the pavement with a sickening thud, the sound of the bike's engine sputtering out into silence. The alley was still. The only sounds left were the shallow breathing of the two men on the ground and the distant hum of the city. The man they had been harassing stood frozen, watching the scene unfold before him. Tom didn't spare him a second glance. He moved toward the downed bikers with the same calm determination that had gotten him through countless roles. He wasn't interested in hurting anyone, but he wouldn't let these two continue their campaign of fear. The first biker slowly started to rise, clutching his ribs with a grimace. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You don't know who we are." Tom stood over him, his voice low and unwavering. "I don't care who you are. No one gets to treat others like this." The second biker, groaning as he sat up, wiped a smear of blood from his lip. He glared at Tom with hatred in his eyes. "You'll regret this." Tom just shrugged. "I'm not here to make friends." With the bikers subdued, Tom turned to face the man they'd been terrorizing. He looked to be in his late 20s, dressed in a loose hoodie and jeans. His eyes were wide with fear, but now there was a glimmer of something else in them: gratitude. Tom could see it immediately. "Are you okay?" Tom asked, his voice softening. The man nodded, but there was a tremor in his voice when he spoke. I didn't know what to do. I thought they were going to, you know." Tom nodded in understanding. He knew that fear. He'd seen it in the eyes of characters he portrayed and felt it in real life too. But tonight that fear had turned into something else. "Where are you headed?" Tom asked, sensing there was more to the situation than just this random encounter. The man hesitated for a moment, then glanced toward the alley entrance, as if weighing his options. I don't know if I can go home. They've been after me for weeks." Tom's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. "Who are they?" Tom asked. "What do you mean, after you?" The man glanced at the bikers, who were now slowly rising, nursing their wounds, but still dangerous. He seemed to hesitate, then muttered, "They work for someone. They're looking for something. Money, yeah, but it's not just that." Tom's instincts kicked in again. This was no longer a random act of street justice. This was something bigger. Something organized. Tom's mind raced as he processed the man's words. His instincts told him there was more to the situation than just two reckless bikers looking for an easy target. The mention of someone they were working for only added weight to the encounter. Whoever was pulling the strings behind these two had to be someone with power, someone who could send people to intimidate and harass others without fear of consequence. He glanced back at the two bikers, who were now standing, glaring at him with seething hostility. They weren't done yet. Tom had a feeling they were just getting started. "I think you'd better tell me what's really going on," Tom said to the man in the hoodie, his voice stern but not unkind. "Before things get any worse." The man, still trembling, glanced nervously between Tom and the two bikers, who were slowly starting to recover their composure. Finally, with a deep breath, he spoke. They'd been coming for me for weeks," he began, his voice shaky. "I used to work for someone. I don't know if you've heard of him, but his name is Marcus Vale. Big-time crime boss. Runs most of the underground business around here, drugs, weapons, gambling. I worked for him for a while. But I got out. And now, they're after me." Tom's eyes narrowed at the mention of the name. Marcus Vale. The name was familiar. Stories about him had circulated in certain circles, whispered among those who knew the underbelly of the city. He was a shadow in the world of crime, a man who operated from the shadows and controlled his empire with an iron fist. No one had ever seen his face, but everyone knew he was the one to fear. "Why are they after you?" Tom asked, his voice low. The man hesitated, his eyes darting around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. I found something. Something I shouldn't have. It's not just money they're after, it's..." He trailed off, looking even more terrified. "What?" Tom urged, stepping closer. "What is it?" The man swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. "A ledger. A list of names. All the people Vale's been working with, the ones who've been helping him cover his tracks. I don't know what's on the rest of it, but it's enough to bring him down. If the right people got their hands on it." Tom's mind began to race. This wasn't just a case of random harassment. The man had stumbled into something dangerous, something that could shatter the fragile system Vale had built. No wonder the bikers were so relentless. They weren't just trying to scare him. They were trying to get their hands on that ledger before anyone else did. Before Tom could say another word, one of the bikers, the one who had recovered first, suddenly pulled out a knife, his eyes glinting with malice. "You should have stayed out of this, man," the biker growled. "Now you're gonna pay." Tom's body tensed, his senses sharpening. This wasn't a simple street fight anymore, the stakes had just escalated. Without thinking, he moved. His training, his instincts, all kicked into overdrive. As the biker lunged forward, Tom sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife flew from his hand, clattering against the pavement. Tom spun the biker around, using his momentum to slam him into the nearby brick wall. The second biker, now enraged, pulled a crowbar from his backpack and swung it at Tom. It was a desperate move, but Tom was faster. He ducked and dodged, moving with fluid precision, before grabbing the biker by the arm and throwing him into the alley trash cans with a brutal thud. The two bikers were down, but Tom knew this wasn't over. They were part of something much bigger, and they weren't going to let a few bruises stop them from getting what they wanted. Tom turned back to the man in the hoodie, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Listen to me," Tom said, his voice firm but calm. "You need to get out of here. You can't stay in the city, not with that ledger. Whoever Vale has sent after you won't stop. You're not safe." The man nodded, though he looked conflicted. "But where will I go? I can't just disappear." Tom considered his options. He couldn't let the man go without some protection, but he couldn't take him with him either. He had too many questions left unanswered, and too many loose ends to tie up. Marcus Vale was a shadow, but shadows always had a way of revealing themselves in the end. "You'll have to trust me," Tom said, his voice low. "I know people. I'll make sure you're safe. But you need to get out of sight for now. If Vale's men know where you are, they'll come for you." The man nodded, his face set with determination. "I'll go. But what about you?" Tom's expression hardened. "I'm not done with this. If Vale thinks he can intimidate people like that without facing the consequences, he's got another thing coming. I'll make sure you're safe, but I've got my own work to do." The man gave him a small, grateful nod before disappearing into the misty night. As Tom watched the man disappear into the shadows, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction mixed with uncertainty. This wasn't just about protecting an innocent person anymore. He had crossed a line. Involving himself in the affairs of Marcus Vale was not something he could easily walk away from. But deep down, Tom knew there was no turning back now. He glanced back at the bikers, who were slowly staggering to their feet. Their faces were bruised, their pride wounded. One of them glared at Tom, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," the biker spat, his voice low and venomous. Tom didn't respond. Instead, he turned his back and walked toward his motorcycle. His mind was already racing, formulating a plan. This wasn't a random encounter, it was part of something much bigger. He had to find out who Marcus Vale was, not just a man, but the organization behind him. It was the only way to stop the cycle of violence that had just begun. As he started his bike and rode off into the night, Tom felt the weight of the decision he had just made. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a man on a mission. And there was no turning back. The following days were a blur of movement. Tom used every connection he had, reaching out to his old friends from his street days, and even some contacts from his acting career. He needed to find out more about Marcus Vale, and he wasn't going to let anyone, or anything, stop him. He learned that Vale's empire was built on a network of fear, with people in key positions throughout the city, law enforcement, politicians, and even businessmen who were on his payroll. Vale was untouchable. Or so it seemed. But Tom wasn't about to back down. He knew that sometimes the only way to bring down a giant was to start small, find the weak link, the crack in the armor, and exploit it. His first breakthrough came when he tracked down an old acquaintance, a man named Benny, a former associate of Vale's who had gone into hiding after a falling out with the crime boss. "You're playing with fire, mate," Benny warned when Tom found him at a rundown pub on the outskirts of town. "Vale's got eyes everywhere. If you go after him, you won't just be fighting bikers. You'll be fighting an army." Tom's eyes burned with determination. I didn't ask for this. But now, I'm not walking away. The next few days were a blur of covert meetings and tense encounters as Tom dug deeper into Marcus Vale's operations. His every move was calculated, knowing full well that one slip-up could cost him more than just a fight, it could cost him his life. But the more he learned, the more he realized that Vale's empire wasn't just about power, it was about control. And the control stemmed from fear. Tom made his way through the murky underworld of London, from back-alley clubs to high-end establishments that masqueraded as legitimate businesses. His contacts were few but trusted, people who owed him favors or had been burned by Vale's ruthless tactics. Each meeting brought new pieces of the puzzle, but it wasn't until he ran into Benny again that the truth began to take shape. Benny had always been a fast talker, but this time, there was something different in his eyes. He was anxious, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone to jump out from the shadows at any moment. "They're on to me, Tom," Benny whispered in a dim corner of a dingy pub. "I can feel it. They know I'm talking to you. I shouldn't even be here." Tom leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Tell me what you know about Vale. The real stuff. Not the rumors, not the stories. What's his weakness?" Benny's eyes flickered nervously. "Vale's not just a crime boss. He's more like a kingpin, with his own court of people who protect him. But I'll tell you this, the ledger, the one that guy was talking about. It's real. And it's in a safe place, a place only a few people have access to. But the key to getting it, well, that's a whole different story." Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Where is it?" Benny's face shifted, the unease in his eyes now giving way to something darker. "I'm not saying. Because I don't know if I trust you enough to give you that kind of power." Tom's patience was wearing thin. "You don't have a choice. Either you tell me, or I walk. And I'm not the only one looking for that ledger." Benny stiffened. "You think you're the only one?" He leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's another player in this game, someone higher up the food chain. Someone who's been working with Vale for years. If you go after Vale without knowing who you're really up against, you're going to get yourself killed." Tom's heart raced as the gravity of Benny's words sank in. There was more to this than just a power struggle between him and Vale. Someone else was pulling the strings, someone who knew Vale's every move, and could be just as dangerous. "Who is it?" Tom demanded. Benny hesitated, glancing over his shoulder again before he spoke. "I'm not telling you who. But you can start by looking into a man named Donovan Black. He's been Vale's right-hand man for years, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. He's not easy to find, but if you can track him down, you'll get closer to the truth." Tom took a deep breath, his mind spinning with the new information. Donovan Black. Another name added to the list of people he would have to face. But this time, it wasn't just about the ledger. It was about finding out who else was involved in Vale's empire, and why they were so determined to keep it all buried. Before Tom could respond, the door to the pub suddenly burst open, and a group of rough-looking men entered. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and their eyes scanned the room with cold calculation. Tom recognized them immediately, Vale's enforcers. Benny's face drained of color. "Shit! They've found me!" Without wasting a second, Tom grabbed Benny's arm and yanked him toward the back exit. They burst through the door and into the alley just as the men began to make their way toward them. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as they darted through the darkened streets, weaving in and out of alleyways in a desperate bid to escape. "Where are we going?" Benny gasped, his breath ragged as they sprinted. "I've got a place nearby," Tom replied, his mind already formulating their next move. "Just keep moving." The sounds of pursuit grew louder, the heavy footsteps of the enforcers closing in. Tom's hand instinctively moved to his jacket pocket, where he kept a small but powerful gun. He wasn't planning on using it, not unless he had to, but he wasn't going to let these men capture Benny. They rounded a corner, and Tom saw the entrance to a rundown building. It was an old safe house he'd used in the past, a place that would provide temporary cover, but it was only a matter of time before Vale's men found them. Tom threw open the door, ushering Benny inside, and slammed it shut just as a few of the enforcers rounded the corner. They stopped in their tracks, eyes narrowing. "There's no way out," one of them growled, drawing a gun. "You're surrounded." Tom turned to Benny, his eyes hardening. "Stay behind me." Benny's hands trembled. "What the hell are we going to do?" "We fight." Tom had always known how to handle a fight. It was one of the things he prided himself on, whether on screen or in real life. The key was not to panic, to think ahead, and to use your environment to your advantage. As the enforcers began to move closer, Tom grabbed a broken chair from the corner and hurled it toward the door, buying them a few precious seconds. The chair splintered upon impact, knocking one of the enforcers off balance. That was all the time they needed. Benny, still shaken but beginning to realize the urgency of the situation, rushed to the back of the room and slammed a metal bar across the window, preparing for an escape route. Tom moved quickly, grabbing a rusty pipe from the floor and swinging it at the advancing enforcers. He caught one of them across the face, knocking him out cold. The others hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was enough. "Go!" Tom shouted, pointing to the window. Benny scrambled toward the window, trying to pry it open, but his hands were shaking. Tom's heart raced as more footsteps echoed through the hall. The enforcers weren't just going to let them slip away. Tom was about to help Benny when the door burst open, and two more enforcers rushed in, guns drawn. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. But Tom wasn't out of options. With one fluid motion, he launched himself at the nearest enforcer, knocking the gun from his hands and taking him down in a flurry of punches. Benny finally managed to force the window open, and they both crawled through, just as the enforcers regained their footing. The cold night air hit Tom's face as he pulled Benny onto the fire escape. Their pursuers were close now, but they had the advantage of the city's maze-like streets. They couldn't stay in one place for long. Tom led Benny through a series of back alleys and hidden paths, moving swiftly and silently. They were now fugitives, but they had a head start. Tom knew it wouldn't be long before Vale's men regrouped, but that didn't matter. They had information. And information was power. As they reached the edge of the city, Benny's voice broke the silence. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running," Benny said, his voice filled with desperation. "They're going to find me. They always do." Tom turned to face him, his expression grim but determined. "They won't find you if we keep moving. But I need you to trust me. If we're going to take Vale down, we need to get that ledger. And we need to find Donovan Black." Benny looked at him, his eyes clouded with fear. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." "You don't have a choice," Tom said, his voice steady. "But I'll make sure you're safe. We're going to finish this." The road ahead was uncertain, but Tom Hardy wasn't one to back down from a challenge. If it meant going head-to-head with one of the most powerful crime syndicates in the city, so be it. He wasn't just in it for the fight. He was in it for justice. And he wasn't going to stop until it was served. Tom's footsteps echoed against the narrow alleyways, his mind racing with the next move. Every corner they turned, every new street they crossed, felt like another step deeper into a world that had long been shrouded in darkness. The network that Marcus Vale had built was far more intricate than Tom had imagined, and each thread led to more danger, more secrets buried beneath layers of violence and corruption. They'd managed to lose the enforcers in the chaotic labyrinth of the city's underbelly, but Tom knew it wouldn't last. They had to move quickly, or Vale's men would track them down. Benny, though shaken, was keeping up, though the look in his eyes told Tom that the fear of the past was finally starting to weigh heavily on him. The two of them found themselves on a quiet street lined with old, crumbling buildings. The streetlights flickered as if struggling to stay alive in the desolate part of the city. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them some brief respite. "We can't keep running forever, Tom," Benny said, his voice trembling slightly as they slowed to a stop. "They'll find us. They always do." Tom didn't respond immediately. He was too busy scanning their surroundings, his mind already calculating their next move. The odds were stacked against them, but Tom wasn't in the business of backing down. He'd been in tighter spots before, and he was used to thinking on his feet. "We don't have to run forever," Tom replied, his voice steady. "But we can't sit still, either. We need to move fast and hit Vale where it hurts, at the core of his empire. We'll need to get that ledger, and to do that, we need to find Donovan Black." Benny shook his head, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "You think we can take down Vale? The guy's untouchable." Tom's jaw clenched. He'd heard enough people say that about Vale over the years. No one had ever dared to challenge him, not for real. But Tom wasn't like the others. He didn't just want to dismantle an empire for the thrill. He wanted justice for everyone Vale had crushed in his wake, from the small-time hustlers to the innocents like Benny who had found themselves ensnared in the web of crime. "Vale's empire is built on fear," Tom said, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "But fear doesn't last forever. Everyone has a weakness. We just need to find it." Benny didn't reply, but the anxiety in his eyes was hard to ignore. Tom understood. Benny had been running from Vale's enforcers for months, terrified that each day could be his last. But running wasn't the answer. They needed to fight back, to take the fight to Vale, and the only way to do that was to take control of the information he was desperately trying to protect. Tom pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. His eyes flicked over the names, some from old allies, others from people he'd worked with in the past. But one name stood out, an old detective from his days working in the shadows of law enforcement, a man who had been in the trenches and had seen more than his fair share of dirty deals. With a deep breath, Tom dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Hardy," the detective said, his voice rough with age and years of dealing with the scum of the city. "You sure you want to get back into this? It's a whole new level of danger now." Tom's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no humor in it. "I didn't call for a chit-chat, Jackson. I need information. I'm going after Marcus Vale, and I need you to point me in the right direction." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "You're serious, huh? All right, I'll bite. But you better be ready for what you're walking into. Vale's got a network that goes deeper than anything I've ever seen. And Black. Donovan Black is a ghost. No one's seen him in years." Tom's heart raced at the mention of Black's name. He knew this was the man who could unlock the final pieces of the puzzle. "I don't care if he's a ghost. I need to find him." Jackson paused again, as if weighing the consequences of his words. "You know who you're really dealing with here? Vale isn't just a criminal. He's connected to some of the biggest players in this city, the ones who control the money, the power. Black's his right-hand man. The two of them, they're untouchable, Hardy. If you go after them, you're not just picking a fight with Vale. You're going up against people who can make you disappear without a trace." Tom's eyes hardened. He had no illusions about the danger. He'd seen the destruction Vale had caused. But he wasn't backing down now. "I don't care who's backing Vale," Tom replied, his voice steady. "I'm not stopping until I brought him down." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line before Jackson spoke again. "All right then. If you're serious, you'll need to start with Black's last known associates. They run in high circles, politicians, businessmen, people who can afford to keep things quiet. But there's one place you might want to check. A safe house in the East End. It's been abandoned for years, but I hear Black used to use it for meetings. If anyone knows where he is, it's someone connected to that place." Tom's mind raced as he processed the new lead. This was exactly what he needed, a starting point. A place to dig deeper, to find out who Black was meeting, who he was working with. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. "I'll check it out," Tom said, his voice firm. "Thanks, Jackson." The detective's voice softened, almost as if he was about to say something more, but he didn't. "Be careful, Hardy. These people, they don't play by the rules. And you're getting into deep water." Tom hung up, not bothering to reply. He wasn't in this to play it safe. He had a mission, and he wasn't going to stop until it was done. The east end of the city was a far cry from the high-rise offices of Vale's legitimate businesses. It was a forgotten part of town, a place where the grime of the city stuck to the walls, and the streets reeked of rot. Yet, it was here that Tom hoped to find his next clue, a possible connection to Donovan Black. The building Jackson had mentioned was tucked away on a deserted street. It looked like something out of a ghost story: crumbling bricks, boarded up windows, and a rusted metal door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Tom approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement. This wasn't a place you visited unless you had a reason, and Tom wasn't the only one who knew its significance. He stepped closer to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. With a deep breath, he pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest as he stepped inside. The place was abandoned, or so it seemed. The room was covered in dust, but there were faint signs of activity: a chair pushed slightly out of place, a discarded cigarette butt smoldering in an ashtray. Tom's eyes scanned the room for any clues, but it wasn't until he reached the back of the building that he found what he was looking for. A hidden door, partially obscured by a heavy curtain, beckoned him forward. He reached for the handle, his breath quickening with anticipation. This was it. This was the place where he might finally uncover the truth about Donovan Black. As he opened the door, the sound of creaking would echo through the silence. What lay beyond was a dark, narrow corridor leading deeper into the building. He stepped inside, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. Every step felt like it was bringing him closer to a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for, but there was no turning back now. The deeper he ventured into the building, the more he realized that this wasn't just a safe house. It was a place where secrets were kept, secrets that could unravel everything. And Tom Hardy wasn't going to stop until he had all the answers. As Tom ventured further into the heart of the safe house, the weight of the city's secrets began to settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about taking down Marcus Vale anymore. It was about uncovering an entire network of power, lies, and manipulation that had existed right under the surface, hidden from the eyes of those who were too busy to look. The walls were lined with old, faded documents, files, and photographs, all carefully organized, but scattered in a way that hinted at long-forgotten meetings, deals made in the dark, and alliances that had long since crumbled. Tom moved carefully, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might reveal more about Donovan Black's whereabouts. And then, he found it. A file, tucked away in a locked drawer, with Donovan Black's name on it. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he carefully slid it from the drawer. He opened it slowly, scanning through the pages of cryptic notes, names, and addresses. There was one location that stood out, a mansion on the outskirts of town. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods. And it was marked with a single, underlined note: Black Sanctuary? Tom closed the file and pocketed it. He had what he needed. It was time to confront Donovan Black. The mansion loomed in the distance, its silhouette outlined by the dying light of the setting sun. From the outside, it looked like a relic of another time, a massive stone structure perched high on a hill, surrounded by overgrown trees and thick fog. Tom stood at the edge of the property, watching it for a moment as the last rays of the sun vanished behind the horizon. It wasn't just a place that felt ominous. It was the sheer weight of what lay inside. Every instinct told him that the answers he was looking for were hidden within its walls, but so were the dangers. The file he'd uncovered had pointed to this place, Black Sanctuary. The name itself seemed like a cruel joke, a place where someone like Donovan Black, the elusive right-hand man of Marcus Vale, could hide from the world and orchestrate his criminal empire in relative peace. But it wasn't peace that Tom had come for. It was truth. It was the key to unraveling the web of corruption that had bound the city for so long. He wasn't alone this time. Benny had insisted on tagging along despite Tom's protests. After everything that had happened, he'd refused to sit on the sidelines. Tom had reluctantly agreed, knowing that Benny's knowledge of Vale's operations was crucial. They moved in silence, sticking to the shadows, keeping their heads low as they approached the mansion. The air was thick with tension. Tom could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him. He wasn't just putting his life at risk anymore. He was dragging Benny along with him, too. But he had no choice. This was bigger than both of them now. As they crept closer to the mansion's gates, Tom's sharp eyes caught movement. There, just inside the perimeter, were 2 armed guards patrolling the property. It was no surprise. A place like this, connected to the highest echelons of criminal power, would have tight security. Tom signaled to Benny, and the 2 of them slid into the nearby trees, waiting for the right moment to make their move. The guards were well trained, but they weren't expecting an ambush from the shadows. As one guard passed, Tom sprang into action, grabbing him by the neck and pulling him into the darkness. A muffled struggle ended quickly with a well-placed punch to the man's jaw. Benny, not far behind, took care of the second guard, a swift takedown that left the man unconscious and bleeding on the ground. Tom's pulse quickened as they moved toward the mansion. He was close now, closer than he'd ever been to the heart of the operation. He could almost taste it. The mansion's interior was just as imposing as the exterior. The walls were adorned with dark, opulent paintings and gold-trimmed furniture, a display of wealth and power meant to intimidate any intruders. But Tom wasn't impressed. He'd seen this kind of lavishness before. It was just a facade, a way to hide the rot beneath. They navigated the dark hallways, using the cover of shadows to avoid detection. Tom's mind raced as he thought of what might be waiting for them further inside. If Donovan Black was here, he was going to have to be careful. There was no telling how many people Black had working for him, how many of them were armed, or how many of them would kill to protect the secrets in this house. As they approached a grand staircase leading to the upper floors, Tom paused, his senses on high alert. A faint noise reached his ears, the sound of voices coming from one of the rooms above. His hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, but he held off. They had to be smart about this. He motioned for Benny to follow him, and the 2 of them carefully ascended the stairs. The voices grew louder as they neared the top, but Tom could make out only fragments of the conversation. "He'll be here any minute. Get the weapons ready. Make sure no one leaves alive. We can't afford another failure." Tom's blood ran cold. They weren't just dealing with Black's security. This was a setup. Someone knew they were coming. He turned to Benny, his voice low. "We need to move quickly. They're preparing for something." Before Benny could respond, a door slammed open, and 2 armed men appeared at the top of the stairs. Tom reacted instinctively, grabbing Benny and pulling him back into the shadows. The men passed by, unaware of their presence. "Stay low," Tom whispered. "We can't afford to get caught now." They moved further down the hallway, finding an open door to a room that looked like it could provide some cover. Tom motioned for Benny to enter first, then followed him inside. The room was dark, but Tom's eyes quickly adjusted. It was an office, and behind the desk, a single chair was occupied. Donovan Black. He was older than Tom had imagined, his face hardened by years of navigating the criminal underworld. Black's icy blue eyes locked onto Tom as soon as he stepped into the room, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "I knew you'd come," Black said, his voice calm and measured, as if he had been expecting this confrontation all along. "I've been waiting for you." Tom didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Every instinct told him that Black was a dangerous man, someone who wouldn't hesitate to end his life if it meant protecting the empire he'd built. "You're a hard man to find," Tom said, his voice steady. "But I'm here now. And I'm not leaving until I have answers." Black leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he regarded Tom with cold amusement. "Answers? You think you can walk in here and take something from me? You're either braver than I thought, or more foolish than you realize." Benny, who had been standing at Tom's side, finally spoke, his voice shaky but defiant. "You've been running this city from the shadows, haven't you? Pulling the strings while Vale gets the glory." Black's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Marcus Vale is a puppet. He always has been. But you're right about one thing, Benny. I've been the one pulling the strings. Every deal, every betrayal, it's all been part of a grand design." Tom took a step forward. "And what design is that? What's your endgame, Black?" Black's eyes flickered with something darker, something that sent a chill down Tom's spine. "Power, Mr. Hardy. It's always been about power. But not just any power, the kind that makes you untouchable. The kind that allows you to reshape the world around you. And I'm very close to achieving it. Tom's heart sank. This wasn't just about money or control. Black was playing a much larger game, one that would affect not just the city, but the entire world. You think you can stop me? Black asked, his voice low and dangerous. You're nothing but a pawn in a game you don't understand. Tom's gaze hardened. I understand more than you think. And I'm going to make sure you never get that power. Without warning, Black reached for a button on his desk, but Tom was faster. He lunged forward, grabbing Black by the collar and slamming him against the desk. The force of the impact knocked several items to the floor, but Black didn't flinch. You really think you're the first person to try and stop me? Black sneered. You won't win this fight, Hardy. No one ever does. Tom stared into Black's cold, calculating eyes. Maybe. But I'll make sure you regret underestimating me. Just as Black's lips curled into a smug smile, the door behind them exploded open, and a dozen armed men stormed into the room. Tom's heart raced as the room filled with chaos. Benny's voice cracked through the tension. We're not getting out of here alive, are we? Tom didn't respond. His mind was already racing, calculating his next move. He'd come this far. There was no turning back now. The gunfire erupted like a storm, echoing off the mansion's walls as Tom dove behind the desk for cover. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was calm. He was used to being outnumbered, used to fighting when the odds were stacked against him. It was what he did best. But even he knew this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything he had come to the city to uncover, for the truth, for justice, and for the people who had been crushed under the weight of Black's empire. Benny was already on the move, diving behind a bookshelf and returning fire as best as he could. Tom quickly assessed the situation. They were surrounded, but they had an advantage. The room was cluttered with old furniture, giving them some cover. But it wouldn't last long. Tom's fingers gripped the gun tightly as he prepared to make his move. There was no way they could win this fight in the open, but he knew how to turn the tables. He'd have to play them at their own game. The final stand was about to begin. The gunfire rained down, relentless and deafening. Tom's heart hammered against his chest, but his mind remained sharp, every muscle coiled with purpose. He was in the thick of it now, his back pressed against the side of the desk as bullets whizzed past him, embedding themselves into the walls with sharp, metallic screeches. Benny's voice echoed in his ear, but Tom could barely hear him over the roar of gunfire. We're not gonna make it out of here! Benny shouted, his words barely audible. Tom's eyes flicked over to Benny, who was crouched behind a bookshelf, returning fire with shaky hands. The young man was scared, but determination shone through his eyes. Tom nodded in agreement, but the truth was, they had no choice but to keep fighting. If they didn't act now, they were dead. The dozen men in Black's employ had the room surrounded, but they weren't invincible. Tom had faced worse odds before. He knew how to use his surroundings to his advantage. His fingers tightened around his gun, and he signaled to Benny to hold his position. Then, in a split second of clarity, Tom made his move. He popped up from behind the desk just long enough to fire 2 quick shots. One hit a man in the shoulder, and the other struck a gunman in the leg, sending him crashing to the floor with a yell of pain. The momentum was enough to create an opening. Tom darted toward the far corner, the sound of rapid footsteps echoing in the chaos. He needed to reach Black, needed to end this before the odds turned too much in their favor. Benny, realizing the plan, pushed forward, firing cover shots to give Tom the breathing room he needed. The noise was unbearable, the clattering of gunfire and the shouts of men in pain mixing in an unholy symphony. But Tom kept moving, eyes locked on Black, who was standing at the far side of the room, an expression of smug confidence on his face despite the chaos unfolding around him. Tom's pulse quickened as he got closer. Black stood there, untouched for now, watching the fight unfold like it was all part of the plan. You think you can beat me? Black's voice echoed across the room, a taunting laugh slipping from his lips. You're out of your league, Hardy. No one has ever come close to taking me down. Tom's jaw tightened, his grip on his gun steady as he advanced. The men around him fell one by one, either too slow to react or too wounded to continue the fight. Each step brought him closer to the man who had built this empire of shadows. Black's eyes darkened as Tom reached the center of the room, his gun aimed directly at him. But there was no fear in Black's gaze. Instead, it was the cold, calculating look of someone who had seen every challenger fall before him. You don't know what you're dealing with, Black said, his hand moving toward a hidden button under his desk. You think you can just walk in here and change everything? You're just one man. You can't stop what's already in motion. Tom didn't flinch. He knew exactly what was coming. The moment Black hit that button, more men would flood into the room, more firepower would be unleashed, and the fight would be over before it even started. With a swift motion, Tom lunged forward, aiming his gun at Black's hand before he could press the button. In a blur of movement, he squeezed the trigger. Black froze for a moment, his fingers still outstretched toward the button. A pained grunt escaped his lips, and he staggered back, clutching his side where the bullet had struck. His smug smile faltered for the first time. You thought you were invincible, Tom said, his voice low and lethal. But the truth is, you're just another man. Black's hand dropped to his side, and he gasped for breath, his eyes flickering with a mix of disbelief and rage. The blood from his wound stained the expensive suit he wore, but it didn't seem to matter now. His empire, his control, everything he'd built, was slipping through his fingers in the face of one determined man. But Black wasn't done yet. With a feral growl, he reached for a gun hidden beneath the desk, but before he could even raise it, Tom was already on him. He slammed Black's wrist against the edge of the desk, sending the gun clattering to the floor. You should have stayed hidden in the shadows, Tom said through gritted teeth, his arm pinning Black to the desk. Black's cold smile returned, but this time, it wasn't out of confidence. It was the smile of a man who had nothing left to lose. You think you've won? Even if you kill me, you can't stop what's coming. My men are already in place. The city is mine, and there's nothing you can do about it. Tom's eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer, his voice a harsh whisper. Not anymore. Before Black could respond, Tom pulled back and delivered a devastating punch to Black's jaw, sending the man sprawling across the floor, unconscious. The remaining gunmen hesitated, unsure of what to do with their leader down. In that moment of indecision, Tom took advantage. He and Benny mopped up the remaining men, working together with calculated precision. Within moments, the fight was over. The once imposing figures who had filled the room with gunfire now lay unconscious or incapacitated on the ground. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, and the silence that followed felt deafening. Benny looked around, his chest heaving as he processed what had just happened. We did it, he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. We actually did it. Tom didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his attention to the mess of paperwork scattered around the room, the files, the phones, everything Black had used to run his empire. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the end of Black's reign, the start of a new chapter for the city. Tom's gaze fell on the file marked Black's Sanctuary, the one he had retrieved earlier, and he knew that this wasn't just about taking down one man. It was about exposing everything, about shining a light on the dark underbelly that had been allowed to thrive for too long. Let's finish what we started, Tom said, his voice steady once more. He motioned for Benny to follow him as they moved toward the room's far side, where Black's network of operations was laid bare. This city belongs to the people, not men like Vale and Black. As they gathered the evidence, Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen, seeing an unfamiliar number. It was a call he had been expecting, but not yet ready to take. It was the police. The sun had already set by the time the police arrived, but the storm of violence had finally passed. The mansion was silent now, its grandiose facade shattered by the battle that had raged within its walls. Sirens echoed in the distance, and soon, uniformed officers flooded the grounds. Tom stood by the front door, watching the scene unfold as the police took control of the mansion. He'd done what he had come to do, but now there was a sense of finality in the air. This was over. For now. Benny stood beside him, his eyes still wide with disbelief. "We actually did it," he repeated, as if trying to convince himself. Tom gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We stopped Black, and we stopped Vale. But the fight's far from over. There's always another villain, another shadow." The weight of the moment hung in the air, heavy with the realization that while one chapter had closed, the story wasn't finished. The city still had its scars, its dark corners, and its secrets. But with the fall of Black, a glimmer of hope had emerged. As Tom and Benny watched the officers secure the mansion, Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. He'd done what needed to be done, not just for justice, but for the people who had suffered under Vale and Black's rule. The game had changed. The power had shifted. And Tom Hardy had won.